Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPAutos.com, your libertarian car guy. You probably can't tell what I'm driving as I'm panning the interior because the interior of cars today increasingly looks pretty much the same because they all have this full-width Star Trek Next Gen style flat screen display now. They went from having sort of a separate dashboard, instrument cluster, and then the touchscreen to the right of that to emulating the trend in the high-end market, the luxury cars that began integrating the two things into a single sheet. So now, even relatively modestly priced vehicles like this Kia Sportage, which is just a small crossover SUV, are also coming with or available with these big screens, which again I'm not a huge fan of for a variety of reasons I won't get into right now. I really wanted to focus on something about the Kia though that I think is worth focusing on that does make it different, which is that it still comes standard with a big enough four-cylinder engine that it doesn't need a turbo or a hybrid to provide it with enough motive power to move the vehicle. If you've been following my stuff, you know I've been ranting about this for some time, about how they're putting, in my opinion, inappropriately undersized engines into vehicles that are too large and too heavy for engines that small, referring here to 2-liter and smaller engines in vehicles that weigh more than 3,000 pounds, some of them more than 4,000 pounds. And so they have to be augmented by a turbo and then increasingly by a hybrid in addition to that to try to give it enough power to move out of its own way. And I've pointed out in prior columns how that this is chiefly something having to do with compliance, i.e. the pressure that's brought to bear on vehicle manufacturers to figure out a way to comply with these regulations that are laid down having to do with fuel economy and emissions. And that now encompasses carbon dioxide. And it's interesting because the federal government doesn't say you have to build this type of vehicle or you can only have this type of engine. They just put forth these regulations that really effectively can only be complied with by certain types of vehicles and certain types of engines. So, that's why you're seeing smaller and smaller engines all the time, and these smaller and smaller engines being augmented by the turbo or the hybrid, and they're usually also paired with a continuously variable transmission, which is another compliance technology. I'm not hating on the CVTs. CVTs have some upsides. They're very smooth, you don't have shift shock because they just vary the ranges, they don't shift gears. But fundamentally, the reason that CVTs are in mass use now in vehicles is again because of compliance, because they offer a slight efficiency benefit relative to an automatic with gears. The downside is that CVTs, as a rule, just by the nature of their design, aren't as durable because they're not as sturdy as planetary geared automatic transmissions with clutches and planetary gears that, by the nature of their design, tend to last the life of the vehicle, or at least they did until they got really, really complicated until lately. Well, anyway, back to this car. So this car comes standard with a 2.5 liter 4, which is a pretty decently big sized 4. Big enough to produce 187 horsepower, I think it is, without need of a turbo. So you don't have to get a turbocharged micro engine in this little Sportage as you do in so many of the small crossovers out there. And the transmission is a conventional 8-speed automatic with gears, not a continuously variable automatic. So right off the bat, not only is that different, but probably, assuming good manufacturing techniques and basic design, more durable and more reliable. I mean in the long term after the warranty. We're not talking about these short-term 4 to 5 year things, which is kind of disingenuous because almost anything that you buy isn't going to have a problem for the first 4 or 5 years and almost certainly will be covered by the warranty regardless. I'm talking about, after it's 8, 9, 10 years old and the warranty's expired, you either still have it or somebody else has it, and what then? And by and large, small turbocharged engines and CVTs tend not to last as long over the long haul. The engines, because they're just under more pressure and they have smaller surfaces within, like bearings, to absorb the pressure. It's just sort of the nature of the design. And the CVTs, the majority of them, have a belt system of some kind, and that belt expands and contracts, and inevitably that results in metal fatigue, and eventually the band fails. And the band fails, it's fairly catastrophic. Parts are strewn throughout the interior of the transmission. It's not generally rebuildable. It's generally you just throw it away and put a new CVT in. Problem is that can cost $4,000 or $5,000. when your vehicle is 9 or 10 years old and it might only be worth 10 at that point, it becomes a difficult decision about whether you're going to spend 50% of its value on a transmission and then worry that some other big thing might fail. So anyway, those are two things that I really like about this Kia Sportage, and we'll have more in terms of a full review up at EP Autos. And in the meanwhile, thanks so much for listening, and we'll have more for you again soon.